Ladies and gentlemen, your excellencies, today, the very foundations of the international legal order, strategic stability, and the UN-centric system of global politics are being put to the test. It will be impossible to resolve the conflicts that are multiplying without getting to their root causes and restoring faith in our ability to join forces for the common good and justice for all. Let us be frank. Not all states represented in this room recognize the key principle of the UN Charter, the sovereign equality of all states. The United States has long, through the words of its presidents, declared its own exceptionalism. This also applies to Washington's attitude towards its allies, from whom it demands unquestioning obedience, even to the detriment of their national interests. Rule America. That is the essence of the notorious rule-based order, which is a direct threat to multilateralism and international law. The most important components of international law, the UN Charter and the decisions of our Council, are interpreted by the collective West in a perverse and selective manner, depending on what instructions are handed down from the White House. And many Security Council resolutions are outright ignored. These include Resolution 2202, which endorsed the Minsk agreements on Ukraine, and Resolution 1031, which endorsed the Dayton Agreement on peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina on the basis of the principle of equal rights for the three constituent peoples and two entities. The sabotage of resolutions on the Middle East can be discussed endlessly. It suffices to mention Anthony Blinken's statement in an interview with CNN in February 2021 in response to a question about what he thinks about the decision of the previous U.S. administration to recognize the Syrian Golan Heights as belonging to Israel. And I will refresh your memory for those of you who may have forgotten. In response to that question, the Secretary of State said, leaving aside the question of legality, from a practical standpoint, the Golan Heights are very important to Israel's security, end of quote. And this, in spite of the fact that UN Security Council Resolution 497, which remains in force, in which we are all very familiar with, qualifies Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights as illegal. However, according to those very rules, we should, to quote Anthony Blinken, leave aside the question of legality. And of course, everyone remembers the statement of U.S. Permanent Representative regarding the fact that Resolution 2728 of March 25th, demanding an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, is not legally binding. In other words, these American rules are more important than Article 25 of the UN Charter. In the last century, George Orwell, in his story Animal Farm, already presaged the essence of this rule-based order. I quote, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others, end of quote. If you fulfill and obey the will of the hegemon, you're permitted to do anything you wish, but if you dare defend your national interests, you will be declared a pariah and sanctioned. Washington's hegemonic policy has not changed for decades. Every Euro-Atlantic security arrangement, without exception, has been based on ensuring U.S. dominance. This has included the subjugation of Europe and the containment of Russia. The main role in this was assigned to NATO, which eventually subjugated the European Union, which was presumably created for Europeans, and shamelessly privatized OSCE institutions in flagrant violation of the Helsinki Final Act. The reckless expansion of NATO, despite repeated warnings from Moscow over many years, also provoked the Ukrainian crisis, starting with the coup d'etat organized by Washington in February 2014 in order to establish full control over Ukraine with a view to preparing an offensive against Russia with the help of the neo-Nazi regime brought to power. When Poroshenko and then Zelensky were waging war against their own citizens in the Donbass and were destroying Russian education, Russian culture, Russian media, and the Russian language in general through their legislation, and were banning the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, no one in the West batted an eye, nor did they demand that their wards in Kiev observe decency and refrain from violating international conventions on the right of national minorities, or the very constitution of Ukraine itself, which also contains these demands. It was precisely to eliminate threats to Russia's security and to protect those people who consider themselves part of Russian culture and who live on lands that had been settled by their ancestors for centuries, in order to save them from legislative and even physical extermination, that the special military operation was launched. It is telling that even now, when multiple initiatives on a Ukrainian settlement are being put forward, few people remember Kyiv's violation of human rights and the rights of national minorities. None of these initiatives include these aspects. Only recently did EU documents on the beginning of negotiations regarding Ukraine's accession formulate a demand to this end, mainly due to Hungary's principled position. However, Brussels' actual capacity and desire to influence the Kyiv regime is questionable. We call on all those who are genuinely interested in overcoming the crisis in Ukraine to ensure that their proposals take into account the key issue of the right of national minorities, all minorities without exception. Silence on this issue devalues peace initiatives, and the racist policy of Mr. Zelensky receives de facto approval. It is typical that 10 years ago in 2014, Zelensky said, if the people in the east of Ukraine and Crimea want to speak Russian, let them be, leave them alone, let them speak Russian legally. Language will never divide our homeland, end of quote. Since then, the US has successfully re-educated him, and as early as 2021, Zelensky, in one of his interviews, demanded that those who feel a sense of affinity with Russian culture get out and go to Russia for the future of their own children and grandchildren. I appeal to the masters of the Ukrainian regime, make sure that it complies with Article 1.3 of the UN Charter, which guarantees the fundamental rights and freedoms of all people without distinction of race, sex, language, or religion. Dear colleagues, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is not content with the war that it has unleashed against Russia through the hands of the unlawful authorities in Kiev, nor is it content with the entire OSCE space. Having dismantled the fundamental agreements in the area of arms control, the U.S. continues to ramp up confrontation. Recently, at the summit in Washington, the leaders of NATO countries reiterated their claim to a leading role not only in the Euro-Atlantic region, but in the Asia-Pacific region as well. The proclaimed intention is that NATO is continuing to be guided by the goal of protecting the territory of its member states. But in order to do this, they allegedly need to spread the alliance's dominance on the entire Eurasian continent and adjacent water. The military infrastructure of NATO is advancing into the Pacific region with the obvious goal of undermining the ASEAN-centric architecture, which for many decades was built on the basis of the principles of equality, recognition of mutual interests, and consensus. To replace the inclusive mechanisms around ASEAN, the U.S. and its allies are building closed confrontational blocks such as AUKUS and other quartets and trios. Recently, the deputy head of Pentagon, Mr. Hicks, stated that the U.S. and their allies must prepare for protracted wars, and not only in Europe. That is the end of the quote. In order to contain Russia, China, and other countries whose independent policies are seen as a challenge to its hegemony, the West is aggressively dismantling the global system that was originally built based on its models. Washington has done everything to blow up, including literally by organizing terrorist attacks on the Nord Stream gas pipelines, the foundations of mutually beneficial energy cooperation between Russia, Germany, and Europe as a whole. At the time, Berlin remained silent, but today we see another embarrassing period for Germany, whose leadership has unquestioningly complied with the U.S. in order to place U.S. medium-range missiles on its territory. Olaf Scholz said very ingeniously that the U.S. has decided to place high-precision offensive weapons systems in Germany, and this is a good decision. And amidst all this, Mr. Kirby the expert on media, spoke on behalf of the U.S. president to say, we're not seeking to unleash a third world war. This would have horrific consequences for the European continent. A Freudian slip, as they say. Washington is convinced that if a new global war were to take place, it would be their European allies and not the U.S. who would suffer. If that's the analysis on which Biden's strategy and Biden's administration strategy is based, this is a very dangerous illusion, and Europeans must become aware of the suicidal role that has been assigned to us. Americans are holding the entire West at gunpoint and expanding their trade and economic war with those they see as undesirable, having unleashed an unprecedented campaign of unilateral coercive measures that are hitting Europe first and are leading to a fragmentation of the world economy.
The countries of the global South, Asia, Africa, and Latin America are suffering from the neocolonial practices of the West. Illegal sanctions, multiple protection measures, restrictions on access to leading technologies are counter to true multilateralism and create serious obstacles to achieving the 2030 agenda. Where are all those attributes of the free market, where the United States and its allies that they taught everyone to follow? Market economy, fair competition, inviolability of private property, presumption of innocence, free movement of people, goods, and capital, all that has been jettisoned. Geopolitics has buried the once sacred laws of the market for the West. Recently, we heard public demands from the officials of the United States, the European Union, aimed at China to reduce excess production in high-tech sectors because the West has started losing its long advantages in that area. Today, instead of market principles, we have the same rules. Colleagues, the actions of the United States and their allies are impeding international cooperation and the building of a more just world. They're taking entire countries and regions as hostages, are not allowing peoples to fulfill their sovereign rights enshrined in the UN Charter, and distracting from the necessary joint efforts to regulate conflicts in the Middle East, Africa, and other regions, and reducing global inequality, eliminating terrorism, drug trafficking, and famine, and other problems. Of course, I believe that it's with good faith it's possible to resolve these matters. In order to stop development following a negative scenario, we want to discuss steps in order to restore trust and stabilize the international situation. First of all, we need to deal with the root causes of the crisis that have unfolded in Europe. Conditions for establishing a stable peace in Ukraine have been set out by President Putin. I won't repeat them. The political diplomatic solution must be accompanied by concrete steps to eliminate threats to the Russian Federation coming from the Western Euro-Atlantic direction. By agreeing to mutual guarantees and agreements, it will be necessary to take into account new geostrategic realities on the Eurasian continent, where continental architecture is being formed that is truly equal and indivisible. Europe risks falling behind from this objective historical process. We are ready to seek a balance of interests. Secondly, restoring regional and global balance of forces must be accompanied by active efforts to eliminate injustice in the global economy. In a multipolar world, there should not be any monopolists or in monetary regulation, trade, or technologies. The overwhelming majority of members of the international community share this view. It's very important to reform as soon as possible the Bretton Woods institutions and the WTO. Their activities should reflect the true weight of non-Western centers of development and growth. Thirdly, significant and qualitative changes must take place in other institutions of global governance if we want them to work for the benefit of all. First of all, this applies to our organization, which up to now, in spite of everything, continues to be the embodiment of multilateralism and has a unique universal legitimacy and and recognize broad range of authority. An important step to restoring the effectiveness of the UN would be a confirmation by all its members of their commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, not selectively, but in their fullness and interdependence. About which form this kind of reconfirmation could take place, we could think together. An important work is being done by the group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter, established at the initiative of Venezuela. We invite all countries that still believe in the rule of international law to join this work. A key aspect of reforms of the UN must be changing the makeup of the Security Council, although this by itself will not lead to productive work unless there is a basic agreement on the methods of work among its permanent members. This thought, nevertheless, does not invalidate the need to eliminate geographic and geopolitical imbalances in the Security Council, where there's clear overrepresentation of the countries of the collective West today. What's been needed for a long time is to achieve a broad agreement on concrete parameters of reform, which will strengthen representation of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It's also important to implement changes in the staffing policy of the Secretariat to eliminate the overrepresentation of nationals of the West and their subservient nations in the administrative structures of the organization. And the Secretary General and his staff, of course, must adhere strictly to the principles of impartiality and neutrality, as demanded by Article 100 of the Charter, which we are constantly reminding of. Fourth, strengthen the multilateralism in international relations must be done through other multilateral organizations, including the G20, in which is represented most of the global majority and Western states. The mandate of the G20 is strictly limited to economic and development, so it's very important that a substantive dialogue on this platform does not include short-sighted attempts to introduce geopolitical topics. An increasingly important role, based on the principles of the UN Charter, is played by BRICS and the Shanghai Organization for Cooperation. It includes countries that represent various regions and civilizations that are cooperating on the basis of equality, mutual respect, consensus, and mutual compromise. This is this global standard of multilateral cooperation with the participation of major powers. Of practical importance for multilateralism are such regional entities as the CIS, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Euro-Asian Economic Community, ASEAN, the League of Arab States, African Union, and CELAC. We see as an important task to develop multiple and diverse contexts between them, including with the support of the UN. The Russian presidency, the Council will devote a topic on its agenda to the Eurasian regional organizations. Colleagues, speaking at the Parliamentary Forum of the BRICS on the 9th of July in St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin said that the formation of a world order that reflects a real balance of forces is a complex and in many ways, a painful process. End of quote. Discussions on this topic, we believe, must be developed without devolving into pointless polemics. They should be based on a sound analysis of all the range of factors. First and foremost, it's important to restore professional diplomacy, culture of dialogue, the ability to hear and to listen, maintain channels of crisis communication. Depending on whether politicians and diplomats can formulate something like a vision of the future, millions of lives will depend on them. Whether our world will be multilateral and just it depends on member states. The foundation is the Charter of the United Nations. If everyone follows its letter and spirit, then the United Nations is capable of overcoming current divergences and to reach a common denominator on most issues. The end of history did not take place. Let's work together in the interest of the beginning of history of true multilateralism that reflects all the richness of the cultural and civilizational diversity of the peoples of the world. I invite everyone to a frank discussion. Of course, it has to be an honest one. Thank you very much.